Hi, welcome back. In this set of slides, we're going to discuss building page layouts. We will discuss the box model, the display property, box aesthetics, floating, and positioning. The box model will dictate the way the browser sizes elements. It's important to understand that every element can be seen as a box. It can have a width and a height, and it can also have padding, which is spacing inside of an element. It can also have margin, which is spacing outside of the element, and it can also have a border. And all of these things work together to determine the actual true size of an element, as well as how much space it takes up within the layout. So you can see here that this being the edge of the element, we have the ability to add a border on the outside of the element, and we can add spacing between that element and other elements that are outside of it by using margin. And here we can have margin on the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. And we can also put spacing inside the element to space content inside of the element away from its wall or its edge here. And the spacing inside of the element is called padding. And same as margin, we can have padding on the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. To demonstrate the box model, I've created two divs here, each with the text "I'm a box" inside of it. And here I've styled divs to have a background color of aqua just so we can see the edges of the element. And I've given them both a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. Okay, so in order to see the outside edge of the elements, we can go ahead and give it a border. And using the border property, I'm able to give it three values. The first one I'm going to give it is the thickness of the border, which is 1 pixel. And I'm going to give it a border style, which I'm going to say dashed. And I'm going to set the color to black. So now we can clearly see the edges of the elements. And if I'd like to space this element from other elements that are around it, I can use the margin property, which is the spacing outside of an element. So here I'll just go ahead and set the margin to 20 pixels. And we can see that will push 20 pixels of space around all sides of the element. Now you'll notice that the text "I'm a box" is right up against the edge of the element. If I'd like to add spacing inside of the element, I can use the padding property. So here I'll say padding 20 pixels. And you can see now there's actually 20 pixels of space inside the element. So for padding and margin, we're able to specify multiple values which will affect the amount of padding or margin on different sides of the element. So for example, if I say padding 20 pixels space 30 pixels, the first number, 20 pixels, here represents the top and bottom. So here I'll have 20 pixels of padding on the top and 20 pixels of padding on the bottom. Now the second value here, 30, will represent the left and the right. So I'll have 30 pixels of padding here and 30 pixels of padding here. So when there are two values, the first value represents the top and bottom, and the second value represents the left and right. Now if I add three values, the first value will represent the top, the second value will represent the left and the right, and the third value will represent the bottom. Now if I use four values, then going around clockwise, the first value will represent the top, the second value will represent the right, the third value will represent the bottom, and the fourth value will represent the left side. So here I have 20 pixels of padding on the top, 30 on the right, 40 on the bottom, and 50 on the left. So again, if I just give it a single value will set the padding for all sides, and two values, the first value will represent the top and bottom, the second value will represent the left and right. And if you have three values, the first value will represent the top, the second value will represent the left and right, and the third value will represent the bottom. And if you have four values, then you can remember the clock. And going clockwise, the first value represents the top, the second value represents the right, the third value represents the bottom, and the fourth value represents the left. And as I mentioned, this works the same for margin. If we give it a margin of 20 pixels 5 pixels, 42 pixels, and 100 pixels, then you'll see here that the spacing around the elements on each side changes. It's also good to be aware of the fact that there's actually 2 different box models depending on which browser you're in. So browsers such as Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and Opera all use the W3C box model, whereas Internet Explorer is a bit of a lone rogue and uses its own box model. Now the main difference is that the W3C box model, when you specify a width to an element, that is specifying the width of the content area, meaning that it is not taking into account padding or border or margin. So in order to calculate the true width of an element, you need to also factor in the padding, border, and margin for how much space it will actually occupy on the screen. Now that's in contrast to the Internet Explorer box model, where when you specify the width of an element, that does take into account border and padding. To illustrate this, let's say that we set the width of our element to 100 pixels. And then we'll say that we had added 20 pixels of padding. And then we'll say we also added 1 pixel of border. Now, even though we've set the width of our element to 100 pixels, that's only taking up the content area, and if we want to know the true width of the element, we're going to have to add on 20 pixels on each side for the padding and another 2 pixels for each side of the border. So in total, our element actually ends up being 142 pixels wide. In other words, even though we have our element set to 100 pixels wide, it's actually taking up 142 pixels of space on the screen. Again, that's in contrast to the Internet Explorer box model, where when we set our element to 100 pixels wide, it actually will take up 100 pixels wide. We just have to keep in mind that we actually have less space for the content now. To calculate the content space, you would have to subtract 1 pixel on each side for the border, and subtract the 20 pixels on each side for the padding. So here we have 100 pixels minus 42 pixels actually gives us only 58 pixels of space for the content area now. So you can imagine that it's pretty annoying if you set the width of your element and it ends up looking like it's 2 different sizes in 2 different browsers. So there's been quite a few solutions over the years to deal with this issue, and I'm going to show you a few ways that you should not approach fixing it, and I'm also going to show you the current best solution for fixing this issue. So these are some CSS hacks. Someone figured out that some browsers would ignore the slash before the word width, and other ones would not, and this would allow you to set different widths for the same element, and one browser would use one width statement and the other would use another. However, this is messy. It creates validation errors in your CSS, so you never really want to do it this way. Pre-CSS3, we used to use another method called the box-in-a-box method, and this actually has really wide support. It works everywhere, in fact, but it's kind of messy in that you end up having double the amount of elements for each container. So here we have an outer div, and this outer div has a width set, but does not have a padding or border set. So remember, the only difference between the 2 box models is that in one box model it counts border and padding and the other one does not. So if you have an element that does not have any border or padding, it's going to look the same width in both browsers. And then in order to introduce padding, we created another box inside of that box, and this one has a class of I standing for inner. And on this inner box, we are setting some padding. So this inner element is going to get as wide as it can until it runs into the edge of the parent, which is set to 100 pixels. And then within that 100 pixel area, it will introduce padding. So this sort of simulates the IE box model in all browsers, but again, it ends up using 2 different divs to accomplish what one div should really be able to accomplish. Fortunately, now in CSS3, we have the ability to set the box sizing property. This will tell all browsers to use the box model that you specify. So if you use the value border box, it will use the IE box model, whereas if you set the value to content box, it will use the W3C model. You can see that at the time of this recording, there's pretty good support for the box sizing property, with over 92% of the population able to use it. It's expected that as older browsers die out, over 100% of the population will have support for the box sizing property.